Hi everyone, my name is Chelsea. Welcome to Little Mountain Ranch and welcome to my pantry. Today I am going to be answering all of the questions that I received on my pantry tour video from last week, which I'll link up here for those of you that haven't seen it yet. I also asked over on Instagram and I received a ton of questions, and I'm really hoping this video will be super helpful for you. I received a ton of questions about the actual construction of the pantry, so I thought I would start this video out with answering those first. The pantry that we're standing in right now is 6 by 10, which is the same size as the cold room that is attached to it, which we'll show you in a second. And this is a really great size for us. I loved the size of the original one, so we just replicated that here. Our pantry is built in our basement, which is partially below ground. So the wall on the back here is concrete, as well as the floor, which really does help to keep it cool. But to help to keep it even cooler in here, the 2x4 walls, which are this wall here, and then also the wall that's behind Dan, who's holding the camera, are they're 2x4 construction, and they're really well insulated, along with the ceiling as well. The other thing that Dan did was to put a vent in the ceiling, which I can show you over here. Dan added in this vent into the ceiling, so this is vented to outside, and we can open and close it depending on how cool we want to keep it in here. And this is working really well. I can feel nice cool air coming out of this. And as far as the cost of the overall pantry itself, it was around $500 Canadian. And how we ended up keeping the cost as low as we did is we repurposed a ton of materials. One of the things that we did is the ceiling that you can see up here. This is some old metal roofing that we found on the farm, and as you can see, it has staining on it and rust stains. I think it looks absolutely beautiful, but the best thing about it is that it was free. And then also the shelving. All of the wood that you can see is reclaimed wood from an old building on our property and also some old fencing. And it was almost like magic finding this old wood and then running it through the planer and having it look and turn out as beautifully as it did. One of the things that I love is the old saw blade marks. I love the old nail holes that are in it. Most of these fences and buildings were built in the 1920s and 1930s. So to be able to repurpose it, they were buildings that were going to have to be torn down. To repurpose it into something that's going to last hopefully another 50 to 100 years felt really, really good. And also with lumber prices being what they are right now, I honestly don't even know if we could have afforded to do shelving like this if we had had to buy this kind of lumber. But Dan and I were talking about other ways that you could build shelving like this economically, and we thought you could use pallets. Pallets are free. If you could either find somebody that had a planer. Our planer isn't a super expensive fancy one. Do you remember what we paid for that? It wasn't a lot. It's old. We've had it for a really, really long, we've had it for a really long time. But you can usually find somebody, maybe a friend that might have a planer, and then you can run that wood through and stain it. And it's just amazing how beautiful you can make wood look with that kind of treatment. We used teak oil on these shelves to bring out all of the gorgeous color in it. And I am so incredibly happy with the way that it turned out. Someone else was asking whether it's difficult to build shelving like this. With some really basic carpentry skills and access to a saw and to a planer, I would say no. I could probably build shelves like this myself. Dan did all these and he has some building experience, but it wasn't really that difficult. As you can see, this is just really basic construction. There's a couple of tricks that we learned though through my brother-in-law, who's a fine woodworker. He does amazing work. Is that he said even if you're using standard wood like 2x4s, 2x12s and things like that, if you can run them through a planer and just take a little bit off of them, it kind of tricks the eye, because our eye is used to looking at things like 2x4s and 2x12s as construction material. And if you change the dimensions of them just a bit, it just makes it look, what's the word I'm looking for? Just like finer woodworking rather than 2x4, because you could even do this with 2x4, just take a little bit off of it and then it just makes it look prettier. That, and then also using plugs anywhere you're using screws, just makes things look nicer. Someone was asking whether there was anything that we would change about the way that we have built this now that we've been using it for the last couple of months. And the only thing that we're going to do to add to it is to add some wood on the bottom so everything's not resting right on the floor. So down here you can see these boxes of toilet paper are on the floor. We just want to raise everything up. And that is just in case there was any kind of flooding issue or anything like that, then we don't end up losing all of our paper products, because most of those are the ones that are sitting on the floor. that is it for the construction part. There are some kind of technical questions about temperatures for storage and the differences between a pantry, a cold room, and a root cellar. So for me, as long as the temperature is kind of around, say, 5 degrees Celsius up to about 10 degrees Celsius is just fine for cold room storage. So the cold room, I have things like cabbages and squash and onions and potatoes stored in there, and that temperature works perfectly fine for that. In the pantry that we're in right now, things don't have to be quite as cool, although cooler is better as long as it's above freezing for just longevity of storage. But the things that are kind of more important are keeping it really dry and also to keep it dark. Those things also help to extend food life, shelf life for food. Generally speaking, a pantry is a place that you're going to store dry goods, stuff like canning, things that don't necessarily have to be kept really cool. A cold room is a place where you'll store things like potatoes and squash and onions and things like that. And then a root cellar is more for your root vegetables and stays even cooler still. A root cellar itself is generally something that is below ground and where you will store root vegetables in any area where it doesn't stay warm enough during the winter to be able to store those in the ground. Because a lot of root vegetables like carrots and beets and turnips and stuff, if it's warm enough and the ground doesn't freeze solid, you can just leave those in the ground and pull them out as you need them. Anywhere where the ground freezes, you're going to need some sort of root cellar. My cold room, however, I have been able to store potatoes in there without an issue all winter long, and it stays about between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius in my cold room, which seems to work well enough. Okay. If you are in the process of designing a pantry right from scratch, then my advice would be, if you have the option of putting it in a basement and having it in an area where you can keep it as cold as you would need for, say, things like potatoes and beets and squash, then do that, because then it can be a multi-purpose room, which is better. If you have the space to have both a cold room and a pantry in your house, then go for it. But if you only have one option, definitely go for the cold room, because you can store anything in there. Cool, dark, and dry are sort of the things that you want to keep top of your list as far as priority when building a pantry. I always receive a lot of questions about whether I have issues with bugs or with mice. And the short answer is no, I don't. And I think the reason that we don't have an issue with bugs in our climate is because it gets really cold in the wintertime, and also it's a really super dry climate. So I have never, in all my years of storing food, ended up with weevils or anything like that in my beans, my rice, my flour, anything. But if you do live in a climate where that is a problem, one of the tricks is when you bring your stuff home to put it in the freezer for 24 hours, 24 to 48 hours, and that will kill off any eggs or anything that's in your food. And I know that sounds pretty gross, but most of the food that you're going to buy probably has something like that in it. So that is a way to get rid of it. One of the other things that you can do is by storing your food in airtight containers and putting bay leaves in with your food, because that helps to deter bugs. And as far as mice go, I use standard stuff like mouse traps. Up over in the corner, you can see that we have steel wool shoved in anywhere where we think a mouse might come through. Mice don't like chewing through steel wool, so use steel wool anywhere where you think a mouse might potentially be able to get in. And one of the things to keep in mind about mice is they can fit through something the size of a dime, so really, really small. One of the things that Dan is planning on doing in this room is putting trim. Like, we'll put the steel wool in all the way around and then put some trim around the edge of it. Just glue it on, because we can't screw it into the concrete up there, but that will also be a big deterrent. I've only had maybe 1 or 2 mice ever in this pantry in the last 5 years, so it's not a huge issue. One of the other things that I learned a few years ago that I do is I use peppermint oil. Mice don't like peppermint oil, so when I'm cleaning my pantry, I'll usually spray down the shelves with peppermint oil, and it makes it smell nice, but also seems to work as a deterrent. You can also even go one step further and plant peppermint around the outside of wherever your pantry is built in your house, just putting it on the outside, and that will stop the mice from coming in through your house. At least that's the theory. I did receive several questions regarding the dehydrator and the fridge and whether that would cause any issues with either mold in the walls or with the wood shelving, and also with rusting on all of my lids. And I thought that was a really, really great question and a good point. Making the decision to have the fridge and the dehydrator in here, we took a couple of things into consideration. The first is, when I'm going to be doing the majority of my dehydrating will be during the summer months, when the pantry itself is actually quite depleted heated, so there's not a lot of jars or anything in here. I'm not having to keep the temperature cool because all of the vegetables have been eaten out of the cold room. So this door will actually be kept open, which will allow lots of ventilation. If there was going to be an issue, then we would just move it outside, but I don't think that that's going to be a problem. I'm not going to be running this in the winter when it is closed up in here. The fridge itself is pretty small and it doesn't give off a ton of heat or humidity, so I really don't think that this is going to be a problem. Should it be a problem, we'll take it out and I will report that back to you guys, but so far it's been in here for a couple months and there isn't an issue. The other thing is that in the wintertime we burn we burn wood in order to have heat and our wood furnace is right beside this room. And any of you that have ever had wood heat before, you know that it makes the air super, super dry. So we already live in a really dry climate as it is, but that dries the air out even more. So I have never had an issue with humidity in any way in our climate, but that is something to keep in mind if you do live in a more humid climate for sure. I have been asked whether or not this is overwhelming, whether stocking a pantry like this can be overwhelming, and it definitely was when I first started. I found it super stressful, and part of why I found it super stressful is because I was trying to do it like other people, and I did a lot of research going on prepper websites and trying to calculate the amount of, or the pounds of food I would need for X number of people, and I just made it really complicated for myself. So I kind of scrapped that a while ago. And I run my pantry really simply. Basically, within about 12 months, everything is turned over in this pantry. So I don't have to worry about expiration dates. So by this time next year, this will be stocked with entirely fresh produce from my garden or meat or whatever else I have on here. And the same thing goes for all my bulk food that's constantly turning over. So I don't keep things like master lists with expiration dates and constantly moving things around in my pantry in order to use up what's in here, because I know I don't store anything that isn't going to last for a year. The only exception to that is probably brown rice and whole wheat flour. Those have about a 6-month shelf life and I turn those over more regularly. So I don't have to worry about it that much, which has decreased my stress about this a ton. The thing that is probably the most stressful and the most time consuming is canning. All of this work takes months and months. I mean, it really does start in February when I start my seeds. I guess actually more in like December and January when I plan what I'm going to be planting in my garden, and then planting all the seeds, getting them started, growing the food, harvesting the food, and then putting it all up in these jars. That part definitely takes a lot. And by the end of September, I'm done. I'm very tired, but it is something that I enjoy doing, and having all of this food here for us for the winter time makes all that work worthwhile. I think that's about it for me today, but if you have any further questions about my pantry or food storage in general, please drop those in the comment section below and I'll either answer them there or make another video in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye guys!